Good afternoon and welcome to University of Illinois Extension's Local Government Education webinar. We are happy to welcome Quinn Adamowski, Regional Advocacy Manager with Landmarks Illinois, as he presents the first of two webinars in our series on downtown restoration and revitalization. Quinn, we're so happy to have you on here to give our communities an idea of what to do with their aging buildings and their downtowns. We know you have a lot of information to cover for us today, so I won't do much. I'll let you introduce yourself and familiarize the audience with what you do and to get your presentation rolling as well. Thank you again for being here.
Great, thank you for having me, and thank you, World Partners and U of I Extension for putting this on. So before I really get into introducing myself, I just kind of want to introduce what we're doing here. So there's the downtown webinar in two parts. So in part one, I decided that I wanted to kind of focus in on the National Register of Historic Places. So the question today is about the implications of source being listed, what the process to be listed looks like, and what resources may be available once you do create a district. And district and individual listing can be considered interchangeable, but for the purposes of today, we're focusing on the district because if you create a district, you're effectively putting a whole bunch of buildings onto the list rather than just focusing. We'll focus on next steps once property or a district is created, once you have designation. So what can you do with it, right? And I'm going to talk about some of the incentives today, but I think in June I'll get into a little bit more specificity. And as it relates to today, this is really meant to be an overview, a high-level look at the National Register. So I'm not going to get into a full and immense amount of details. I want this to be digestible, and of course, I'm happy to answer any micro-level questions today or offline. Happy to take emails. And I know that oftentimes this can be a little confusing, and so I'm just going to do what I can to kind of dispel misinformation and just sort of create a base level of knowledge for everyone. So before I get into the National Register, I do want to take a few minutes to talk about Landmarks Illinois and in my role. Landmarks Illinois is a resource to individuals, nonprofits, government entities, really anyone for preservation-related issues. We are the statewide nonprofit focused on preserving, protecting, and promoting architectural and historic resources through advocacy and education, and most states have an organization like us. We are member-based, and we're always looking to expand our network of advocates. So I would encourage you to look at our membership page and see what that may entail. Our history starts back in 1971. The Old Chicago Stock Exchange was an iconic structure, and for reasons, lots of reasons, people decided to tear it down, and a local group of advocates, formed a group to fight against that. And they lost that battle, but that resulted in this organization that I work for today. In my role as Regional Advocacy Manager, I'm a statewide advocate, so to speak. Landmarks Illinois was based in Chicago from 1971. And it is still based in Chicago, but it was solely based in Chicago in 1971 through 2013. The Springfield office created. So there was a director of the Springfield office. And that is now our COO, Frank Butterfield. He served in that role for many years. And then I came in as Regional Advocacy Manager in 2021. So my responsibility is to work with folks across the state. My territory is from Galena to Richmond, down to Quincy, down to Cairo, to Golconda, and all the way back. So I basically have the entire state outside of Chicagoland. So who are we? We are people saving places for people. That is how we view ourselves. As you see here, our mission statement is to preserve, protect, and promote architectural and historic resources in Illinois through advocacy and education. And we have a vision statement, obviously. And I want to just briefly talk about our values. So yes, historic preservation oftentimes is considered dusty and academic and old. And, you know, again, it has this sort of, people have this mindset around it, which is understandable because of many ways that preservation organizations or preservationists for that matter have sometime acted. So our organization is focusing on innovation. We believe that we're at the forefront of historic preservation field. We're trying to change the mindset. We're trying to get away from some of the old thinking, and we're trying to bring in inventive ideas and solutions to better help people save places that matter to them. This is not about us saving a place because we want to save a place. It's about us helping local folks save places that matter to them. And we do that through education. You know, something like this, or I do go to speak with city council groups. I do a lot of Zoom calls. You know, again, my job is to work with people across the state. So we seek and share knowledge that furthers our mission and vision and helps people at the local level. And we do have a sense of stewardship. You know, preservation is progress. It should be considered as such. And by reusing places of the past, you know, we can conserve irreplaceable cultural resources for people today and into the future. And we do view ourselves as an organization that is set up to help empower people and improve lives, right? Again, we are people trying to help people save places for people. This is us working with anybody and everybody to look at the cultural resources that they have, the historic resources they have, and figure out what to do with them, right? And that goes right into with the intro, with this idea that, you know, we have a lot of old buildings in a lot of communities, and especially a lot of rural communities that are just coming down, right, because of lack of maintenance. And so what are the answers? And of course, there's never great answers all the time, but you know, if you look at the wide range of answers, you know, you can always try to find something that's going to work for your particular situation. And so what do we do, right? So I guess the easiest way to frame what we do, our CEO, Bonnie McDonald's recently said this, we're effectively wraparound services in the preservation. And I think that's a great way to look at it. So we engage in advocacy and technical assistance. We work on public policy and legislation. For example, right now we are working on expanding and enhancing the Illinois State Historic Tax Credit, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We do have some grant resources for people. We have 4 different grant programs. We do surveys and databases. So for example, we have Women Who Built Illinois database, a World War I Monuments database. We also have a Illinois Restoration Resource Directory, so qualified contractors and people who live in the preservation space do approach us and ask that we share their information on our webpage. So that data directory is available at landmarks.org as well. And then the 2 programs that probably most people are familiar with are, you know, the first is Most Endangered Historic Places. We just had our announcement on May 4th, and to the right there, you can see a picture of Brooklyn, Illinois, which we actually listed as the entire city. And the Most Endangered Historic Places program is meant to highlight important historical and cultural resources that are in danger for one reason or another. And then the flip side of that, we have the Richard Driehaus Foundation Preservation Awards, and that's meant to celebrate, you know, excellent projects that have taken place throughout the state as well. So that's who I am, that's what we do. And I want to get into the meat of our discussion today. And let's just briefly talk about, you know, what is historic preservation? And again, there's this idea that it's dusty and this academic thing, and it can be, but it doesn't have to be. So I mean, in a general sense, you know, as I put a very brief definition there, it's active conservation and protection of historic resources that are significant to our personal or shared stories. So the idea is to save places that matter to us collectively or individually, right? And within the idea of preservation, there's this concept of landmark. So what is a landmark? So there can be a local landmark, there could be a national landmark, or which are designated, or they're just things that we consider landmarks that don't have any designation at all. And I'm going to get into a little bit more of the differences during this presentation. And historic preservation is at the center of the intersection of arts, entertainment, sociology, anthropology, tourism, etc. It is not a standalone. It definitely interacts with all these different spaces. And, you know, especially now, there's a movement to tell a full story, to tell the whole history of communities through place and through places and through buildings, right? Or structures for that matter. And so that's where preservation is headed, right? It's not just so much about the building, it's about what that building's or structure's relationship with the people who live there. And of course, for the purposes of this presentation today, I think the two things to really focus in on are adaptive reuse of historic structures, because that's how you save old buildings, right? Like that's oftentimes the way that's the way it's gonna work. And preservation should be looked at as an economic development tool. It can be very additional investment. We've seen that throughout the state, and I definitely will be talking through some of those examples on June 13th. So what is a National Register of Historic Places? It's the country's official list of historic resources worthy of preservation. And it's a program run by the National Park Service, but it's managed by Illinois by the State Historic Preservation Office. Now I'm going to refer to SHPO frequently. They are an extraordinarily important organization, government function for the state as it relates to preservation, as it relates to incentives around preservation. Frankly, they'll be the ones that you would be working with directly to answer a lot of questions and seeking a lot of guidance. And so what is listed, right? Like what is this register? So there's over 94,000 listings in the United States. There's around 2,000 individual or district listings in Illinois. And actually every county has some sort of listing in the state. So all 102 counties have something. And districts can have hundreds of properties. So, you know, when we say you have one district, well, there could be 300 buildings in that district that qualify for all these different incentives that I'm going to speak about. So before I even get into the good stuff, I want to dispel some of the misinformation. So I'm just going to start with this. What about property rights, right? Like we don't want to landmark things. We don't want to do that. People are going to tell me what I can and I can't do with my building, right? So I just want to go through a little bit of that first. National Register properties are not local landmarks. Okay, so what that means is at a local level, buildings are landmarked through ordinance. And there's local review and local oversight, what's going to happen with that building. And that's generally going to work through a historic preservation commission. So just to be clear, if you're on the National Register, you are not local, right? You are not subject to local overview. You can have a building and or a district that is both national and local. Okay, so listing on the register does not require, that's a key word, does not require private owners to obtain approval to change their property when not using state or federal funds. If you have something listed, it's mostly honorific. If you want to use federal or state funds, or you need a federal or state permit, there is a review process for questions around that bill, but that's a choice. You don't have to choose to use state or federal or funds. And it does not require restrictions on use. So if you have an old commercial building that you want to turn into apartments, great. If you have an old church that you want to turn into a house, that's cool too. As long as you're not using state or federal funds. And even then, there might be space to discuss. Listing does not require private owners to preserve or restore your building or to allow access. If you have a building that's on the register, either by way of district or individually listed, and you want to let it sit there and crumble, you are entitled to do that. Listing does not place any obligation on private owners. Same thing, right? So just because it's listed, you're not mandated to do anything with it, really. Now, of course, there could be local ordinances, there can be local code around properties and whether or not there's upkeep and there's violations, from one thing to another. But it's not particular to being on the National Register. So, okay, why list my property, right? What are the benefits? So I know what it's not. So what is it? Again, it's mostly just a recognition. It's mostly honorific, unless you're looking to use some of the incentives that are attached to it. So there are federal and state tax incentives. I will get into what those are a little more specifically here in a minute. But again, just for the purposes of the overview here, you can choose to follow the rehabilitation standards if you are seeking an incentive. If you're not seeking an incentive, you don't have to follow any rehabilitation standards. There are also federal and state preservation grants if owned by a nonprofit or government. And I do have some links later on to some of these resources where these grants exist. And oftentimes, in order to get some of those grants, you have to be part of a district or have to be individually listed, though not always. And there is some protection in select cases. And I'm not going to get into all the very specific details of what that means. But there are scenarios where, if you are using federal or state funds, okay, that now we have a review process. Or if there's no need for permitting federal or state, then there's a review process. But at the end of the day, if, I'm a building owner that wanted to demo, with all those things being present, it doesn't really mean that I can't necessarily pursue demolition, right? And of course, we don't want it, that's not the end goal here, but my point is that while being on the National Register or being eligible for the National Register has some protection for buildings, it's very limited, and it's very particular to particular situations. So there has to be variables in play really for that to be a thing. And so what is eligible to be listed, right? So we have buildings, which we're going to refer to a lot, sites, structures, bridges can be on the National Register, and of course districts. So, if you have multiple buildings or multiple historic cultural resources, you can create a district. That's what we're going to talk about now. So what is a National Register historic district? It's a defined area with multiple historically significant properties. So just think of your downtown, think of your Main Street, right? Just put boundaries around your Main Street. Of course, you have some carve-outs, but just for simplicity, just think about it that way. And within Main Street, within your boundary, you're going to have contributing and non-contributing buildings. And of course, anyone can nominate for an individual listing or for a district. So there's oftentimes confusion about contributing and non-contributing, right? This is very preservation-y language. So what makes a building contributing? It possesses historic significance, whether it be local, state, or national. It meets at least one of the National Register criteria, which I did not plan on getting into. I can answer questions about that later if there's interest, but again, there are resources that point to what those criteria are. That retain historic integrity. So even if you just have an old building that's been completely changed and it looks nothing like it was supposed to or did in the past, it's not necessarily going to be considered contributing. And generally, that needs to be 50 years old or more, though there have been select cases where buildings have been part of a district and put on the register by themselves, being slightly younger than that. So tax incentives, all right, like this is it. So we're interested in having a district. What does that mean for my town if I'm a mayor or economic development professional, Main Street person, what are these tax incentives? How can I wrap my head around these? So being on the National Register by way of individual or district makes you eligible for these incentives. And the Federal Historic Preservation Tax Credit is up to 20% tax credit for qualified expenses. So just using easy numbers, right? In theory, if I had a $10 million project and I followed the standards and I worked the State Historic Preservation Office to do this project the right way, then I would see a $2 million tax credit over the course of 5 years. So you're effectively reducing your project by 20%. At the state level, we've had a tax credit. This is the 5th year, and I mentioned earlier that we are working to expand the program for another 5 years, so through 2028, and to increase that is available to be allocated to projects. And so the federal tax credit is, so to speak, unlimited. Like anybody can apply for it, and as long as you do what you're supposed to do, you can get it. The state tax credit is not. Each year, right now, there's a $15 million cap that's available to projects, which means that a lot of projects that are interested in getting this tax credit have not been able to. And again, we're trying to change that. But if you are a project that does get an allocation, you can get 25% tax credit for qualified expenses. But there's a key part of this, up to $3 million. So the $10 million project, right, you could get 25% there, but if you get into a $20 million project, then you're not going to get that full amount. And like I mentioned the must follow Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. So the credit's available, but you have to follow certain guidelines. And I mentioned the State Historic Preservation Office, and I'm going to keep referring back to them. There are project reviewers, and this is what they do. They work with architects, they work with local communities to figure out what needs to be done or what needs to take place in order for tax credits to be a viable option. And importantly, we see this across communities across the state, and it's increasing. It's affordable housing. Up to 3 million, 25% here, and I got 4% here, and it makes doing some of these very complicated projects doable. Yes, there's quite a bit of work that goes into doing that, but there are resources available to communities, including SHPO, us, private consultants that help work through a lot of these questions. And I just want to reiterate that these incentives are a choice, right? Even if you're on the National Register, it doesn't mean that you have to go and pursue tax credits and go through all the paperwork of what that looks like. You could just keep it as an honorific aspect and perhaps someday apply for a grant if you're a nonprofit or a government. And importantly, it's for income producing property. So this is not for trying to redevelop my house. These are not monies available to a private residence. So those are sort of the tax incentives, right? And so now, of course, the group that we're speaking with today, we have the rural partners, and we have to ask ourselves, like, okay, so there's this National Register thing, there's this district, but like we're a small community, so why is this important to us? Why does this matter to me, right? And I mentioned that there's about 250 districts statewide, and I just picked a few. Some of these communities have 500 people or less, some are approaching 6,000, but this is a sampling of those that do have districts. There's many more, but I just wanted to show that districts are not unattainable. They definitely are, as you can see here, with the widespread that we have throughout the state with these districts. And so okay, we see that there's a community of 500, we're a community of 1,000, these tax credits do sound great, these other incentives sound wonderful. We want to promote our heritage tourism, so being on the National Register could be helpful for economic development that way. So how do we do this? Like, what is the process to create a district? And this stands the same for an individual property as well. So the first thing I would suggest is that you contact the State Historic Preservation Office to just express the interest and seek any clarity that you may have about the process. And there's wonderful staff there that will help walk you through the details and sort of talk through all of this that you see up here. This is a very truncated version of the information that's available out there. And then you have to complete what's called a preliminary review form. It's basic information, basic history, some photos, so just general information that is shared with the State Historic Preservation Office, so they can look at it and say, yes, this would definitely be considered eligible for the National Register. They refer to that as giving you a positive opinion for possible listing. Once you receive that, then it's like, okay, then we're going to go through this process. So you complete and submit a nomination form and submitting materials. Full disclosure, there's a lot to these. Oftentimes they can turn into full-scale research papers, and there's a lot of research that does need to be done. Individuals can do them, planning departments can do them, anyone can do them. Oftentimes cities will issue an RFP and seek the assistance of a consultant to do this work. And generally, of course, there's different parameters and things, lots of variables. But generally, I think for smaller communities, you're probably looking at somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000 to hire a consultant to do this work. And there are resources available to kind of offset some of those costs. And I'll get into those towards the end here. And then once the nomination is put together and the materials are submitted, there may be some comments from the SHPO staff about maybe needed changes or adjustments, especially when it comes to a district and the boundaries. They may recommend or ask that the boundaries be adjusted a little bit, just to make sure that as this process moves forward, there's not any pushback from the National Park Service. Right? There's very particular guidelines that are from the Park Service that the State Historic Preservation Office has to follow and works with local folks to get them to be in compliance. Once the nomination is quote unquote complete, that goes to an organization, Illinois Historic Sites Advisory Council, and they review the nomination and they make a recommendation. And so they will recommend to the State Historic Preservation Officer that this should be on the National Register, and the SHPO officer then nominates on behalf of the applicant to the National Register. And then there's a review by the National Park Service, and within 60 days or so, they're going to give a response. And if it's approved after the review, then the district is designated in the National Register. So that's sort of the process, and of course it can take time. It can take quite a bit of time to do this. When you're talking a district, especially if you're hiring a consultant, you're talking about writing that RFP, issuing the RFP, having a review team, working with them, then they have to do the research, get access to historic materials, whether that be through a museum, library, etc. Then they have to do this research and then write the nomination, and then you go through. So it could easily take 1 year to 2 years to go through this process. So who can help, right? Like, who can help answer questions about all of this? Where can we learn more? So I've listed some, I think, key resources that are available to you. Now, there's many more. I mean, you can find a ton of other resources through, through Google or what other search engines you might want. But these are the ones that are tried and true and trusted. So you have the SHPO office. There is a ton of information, preservation-related information on their webpage. And actually they have a lot of information about downtown redevelopment on their webpage. So If you do have interest in looking at the National Register as a possible tool in your toolkit, I would strongly encourage you to spend some time on the DNR website to look through all the very important information that they do have. I would say it's very digestible, and again, if there is need for clarity, the staff there is always willing to answer those questions. And then, of course, there's the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the National Park Service itself, right? So you'll find a lot of the regulatory information there. You'll find a lot of the guidelines, a lot of the history around preservation there. And then I mentioned earlier the Illinois Restoration Resource Directory. If you did have interest in a consultant, for example, in seeking help with graded nomination, we do have a section there for consultants that do that work. For any other preservation-related issues, you need a contractor for something. There's information there. And then, of course, I'm here as a resource. So this is my job, right, is to try to connect people with the State Historic Preservation Office or with other resources, or to just answer questions, at a general level, or in many cases, a specific level. That's what I'm here for, and I'm happy to do that, and I do that with communities across the state. So, okay, this all sounds great. We know that we have some help. We know that we can get some guidance. We really like this idea of potentially hiring a consultant, but we don't have all the money in the world. So where do we go? Where can we find some resources to help us? So the state has called Certified Local Government Matching Grant that requires communities to be a CLG. Which again is you could probably do a whole webinar just on that, but there's a process for that, and it requires a commission in order to do that. But it could very well be worth it, because CLG grants oftentimes are 70-30 matching grant, and so if you want to do something like a survey, or if you want to do a National Register nomination, those dollars are available to communities, and you can apply year to year for different projects. And of course, there's us, Landmarks Illinois. We do have a couple grant programs that will help offset some of the costs to a maximum of $5,000. We have the National Park Service. There's a lot of resources available there, and they oftentimes come up with new programs. A lot of programs about expanding the idea of preservation and trying to tell the whole story. There's a lot of information there. And they're constantly adding new things. A key, an absolutely key organization germane to this discussion, and definitely to downtown revitalization and restoration, is Main Street America and Illinois Main Street. And I know that there will be a webinar coming up here in the future from Illinois Main Street. Wonderful organizations, a lot of resources there. Not just financially, but just talking about ways to promote downtowns, to revitalize downtowns. Strongly encourage you to check out mainstreet.org and Illinois Main Street. But there are funding opportunities there that you'll find, and there's some that are very specific to smaller and rural communities to help in efforts to save old stuff and create catalytic opportunities. And then there's the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. There are just dozens of grants available in the DCO webpage. DCO is broken up into regions, and so each region does have people that can help provide guidance on what a lot of these resources are, how to apply for them, what they may mean. So again, encourage you to go there and look for possible resources available, not just for hiring a consultant, but just really for any kind of revitalization efforts. DCO does grants all the time. And one I do want to highlight is CDBG, Community Development Block Grant. That is available to communities to apply directly to the state through DCO. And you can apply for CDBG funds to help with the National Register nomination if you check certain boxes, particular to CDBG. But that's one I always mention to communities to look into. That is a federal program that the state administers. And for communities under 50,000, under 75,000, you have to apply directly to the state. So that is my very brief overview, very 30,000-foot overview of the National Register. Again, this is a potential tool in your toolbox. None of this is required, but it's something to consider. And we talked about some resources here to help walk through some of that or to provide some guidance. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Quinn. That was a great overview. We did have one question come through early on saying that Illinois has a rich agricultural past and present. As family farms decline in number, barns, such as such a strong emblem of this agricultural heritage, are usually over 100 years old, and they're falling down and being demolished at an alarming rate, but they hold sort of that potential for preservation. And so while it's not a downtown, is there perhaps any thought or any efforts devoted to preserving these iconic and often beautiful historical buildings? So what can you tell us about barns and such?
Yeah, I mean, farms, structures on farms, whether it be a house or a barn, silos, etc., absolutely could be eligible for consideration on National Register. Again, depending on whether they have historic significance. And the farms pose an interesting question, or sometimes even dilemma, because they're privately owned, right? And so, if you're looking for incentives from the register, it has to be an income-producing property, but you get in kind of gray area there because a homestead is not an income-producing property, even though it's part of the overall landscape. So I think that, just in general, farmsteads are something definitely could definitely be considered for the National Register. I'm happy to talk with anybody about a specific case. And again, I'm not the only, there's other people, SHPO as well, and others, but I think it largely is going to depend on the particulars of an individual case. There's not a one-size-fits-all answer for that. I hope, does that answer the question, I hope?
Thank you, that's helpful. And we can continue on to some other questions. There is a question that came in from City of Highland Historical Commission that does certified local government ultimately require a design review in the ordinance? This is a big hurdle that our group needs to overcome. So if you know of, if there's oversight on specific property that would qualify. So if you can speak to that question, that would be great.
Okay, can you repeat that one more time?
Does certified local government ultimately require a design review in the ordinance? I think this was in regards to the requirements for the designation. And so some of the city work that has to go along with that. I don't know.
Yeah, so I mean, if you have a certified local government, there's going to be a review commission, right? And so you have an ordinance locally that establishes local incentive programs or local landmark rules, right? And so if you create the CLG, it's more, maybe not oversight is the right way, but things that are germane to a local landmark are going to go through that. Things that are even National Register, if there's a review process or a need for review, the CLG is going to be involved in that. So the review process, the ordinance is really kind of up to the community. Now, I mean, there are certain parameters that need to be met, and there actually is somebody at the State Historic Preservation Office whose job it is to work with CLGs to kind of walk through some of those details. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but there has to be some, preservation-related review processes in place if you want to be a CLG. I mean, that's sort of the whole point, right? Is you can't be a CLG and not do the preservation. It has to go hand in hand. And we have seen some issues throughout the state where we have CLGs that are not necessarily doing that. And then that, becomes problematic. But that's more of a local issue, right? So I think the particular issue that this community might be having, I think either these should be probably answered offline, either by me or SHPO staff for the CLG. But just in general, yes, CLGs have requirements for review processes.
Thank you. Another participant wondering if there are restrictions for religious organizations.
Not necessarily, and there's actually other resources available to religious organizations that I did not bring up here. In fact, I think what I can do is after the conclusion of this, I will forward you some links there that you can share with the groups. But no, I mean, religious organizations do have resources available to them, but that's going to be through grants. Because again, they're not income producing properties, so they're not going to be able to utilize tax credits. But it does open the door for grant programs that I just did not refer to here because I was thinking more about along the lines of economic development.
Sure, thanks. And of course, if you have any links that you want to send along for me to include, I can do that. And I can imagine that, I mean, that's quite a good question. A lot of older towns might have these older buildings that are, even part of the downtown or something that are, cathedrals or some sort of larger building like that. So that would be great. We have another question here. After a project is executed using federal tax incentives and then completed, does the property owner have to stay in contact with the state?
So once everything is completed, right, like it's done. And so if there's need to make other adjustments, yes. But it's not like, the state's going to come knocking on the door once a year and seeing what you're doing, or that you necessarily have to report back on a regular basis. It's not meant to do that. It's meant to incentivize, the redevelopment within historically appropriate ways.
Great, and I know that you've done some communications and meeting with counties as well at the county level. Sometimes this is more of a question I'm putting to you, if you have counties that are looking at, smaller communities, maybe they don't have a metropolitan area, but these smaller communities that are all sort of having these historic districts needing established for these smaller blocks or something. Do you know what role a county government can play and what role folks might be able to play in getting started if there's that question that always comes up, a concern that always comes up with capacity in those counties that are sort of not as populous, etc.
Yeah, I think counties should and could be a wonderful resource, especially within lower populations. Counties can actually be a CLG as well, and so those they exist obviously. So in communities where you do have, let's say a population of 300, and there's not a city planner, right? It's a mayor form of government, but it's a part-time mayor. If there is a planning staffer at the county level, or there's an organization adjacent to the county, yes, they absolutely could and should be a resource to folks. And we talk with county officials on a regular basis, especially in the more rural areas. It doesn't really matter ultimately who's applying for the National Register, for example, or who's seeking a grant, as long as those things are in compliance with either federal or state regulations or requirements. And so I think that counties should and could be the answer for a lot of smaller communities.
Thank you. Have a couple more questions here that have come up, and are there information or guidelines or resources on starting a county historical commission?
Yeah, I would suggest going to the State Historic Preservation Office website and then going right to certified local government. There's a tab for that, and there's information sheets available. And then if you are looking to form a commission, there is a model ordinance that's available through State Historic Preservation Office. We also have a copy of it, obviously, and in fact, I can include that with the follow-up links regarding religious organizations, so everybody has what a model ordinance could look like.
Great. Well, we have a little bit of time left for the hour today. Want to give them an opportunity to maybe put some other questions they might think of in the chat. There's really no such thing as a rudimentary question. We're all learning here together today. So that being said, along the lines, Quinn, of where folks can get started, I always want to speak for those folks who are on the calls that are still almost getting started. What do you suggest for drumming up conversations and engagement with property owners and such for this type of work?
So I guess that largely depends on what aspect the community has, right? So if you have an economic development person, that's a great place to start. If you have a city manager, village administrator, right? I think it depends on who you have to work with. Having said that, we Landmarks Illinois, I'm a resource to kind of talk through that. A lot of what we do is strategy work, developing a playbook for communities, because every community is different. All the needs are different. Of course, there's a lot of overlay and a lot of similarities, but there's always going to be nuance. And I think knowing, at least in my case, if I understand the dynamics of a community, then I can offer suggestions or help create a path, especially when it comes to talking with building owners, because oftentimes building owners are very apprehensive because there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about the National Register. I'll just, as a quick example, and of course I'm willing to do this for any community. Back in December, I went to Watsika and I did a presentation very similar to this for them to the city council to encourage. They had interest in potentially applying for a district. So I went through, again, very similar presentation. And then I did a Q&A. And there were some property owners there that had some very pointed questions and gave them the answer, right? So I think it's about having conversations, it's about creating dialogue. And we're absolutely willing, and we want to do that. We want to help communities, engage with property owners in that way. And I would encourage folks to look at the Main Street model, to look at Illinois Main Street as well, because that's a lot of what they do is trying to work with building owners to figure out a path forward for their communities. And I think when we look at the June 13th, there's a couple of communities I'm thinking through that have created programs using TIF funds, for example, to work with building owners to incentivize them, to follow a path of preservation. So I would encourage folks to contact me, contact SHPO, contact Main Street, and we're all willing and we want to help communities have these conversations, because that's really the job. We can sit on the sidelines and watch important historic structures that could be economic catalysts crumble, or we can collectively work together and create a real dialogue around what preservation is and is not and could be. And I think the more that we do that throughout the state, the better off everyone will be.
Thank you. We do have some more questions that came in, but I am first wondering if you could quickly plug what your next webinar is going to cover.
Sure. So, I mean, so today, obviously, we covered the National Register and being a district, and what that's a tool, right? It's not a requirement, but it's an underlying tool that you can pair up with a TIF district or an SSA or, you know, CDBG funds or whatever the case might be. It's just another option for communities. And so it's a baseline. And I think what my goal is for the second one is to talk through, okay, here are some communities that created a district, and here are some projects that resulted, and here is the experience that they've seen as a consequence, right? So success stories of using a district. And then there's communities that have creatively used TIF funds to encourage revitalization, which I just referenced. And there's communities that have, you know, building hoarders, and what do you do with them? And then how do you work with them to either sell their properties to someone who has the capacity to do something with it? You know, what do communities do when they have their main street crumbling because, you know, they can't enforce code, or they just don't have the personnel to do that? My goal is on the 13th is to go through examples of solutions for problems like that, right? Or success stories around preservation-related economic development.
Wonderful. So there's a question here asking if you could go over the types of entities that are eligible for the grants. If you're familiar at those levels of the different funding opportunities and want to throw out, if you're aware of a good, you know, comprehensive list of entities that might be eligible for the different funding opportunities, that would be great. It's a lot of pressure to know exactly every single, that whole list, but if you can give folks an idea, the different funding opportunities and what those eligible entities would be to the extent of your knowledge, that would be great. There's a
so, and I hope I'm answering this question, and if not, I'm happy to listen to the question again and answer it again. So I referenced, you know, the National Park Service and some other areas where you could find grants, right? And then grants are fluid. I mean, some have been around for a long time, but some are fluid, some are new, some go away. And some are based, you know, strictly just around preservation from a building perspective. Some are based around preservation from a cultural and storytelling perspective. And again, those are always evolving. Who's not going to be eligible for a grant are private owners, right? Like if you're a private homeowner, like that's just not a thing. If you're a private building owner, trying to go after one of those grants is a little bit more definitely difficult and not likely unless it checks a lot of different boxes, you know, germane to storytelling, you know, flipping something into a museum, for example. And so generally the entities that are going to be eligible to apply for grants are nonprofits and government. And oftentimes you will see nonprofits and government working in concert to stack a couple different grants together, or, you know, just co-authoring a grant because maybe the nonprofit doesn't have the capacity to write one, but there's an opportunity there for a joint venture. And so you'll see the city staff effectively apply on behalf of the nonprofit, and then they work together on, you know, whatever the case might be. So museums are a great example of this, where if they want to do some more interpretive language, they can go after one of these preservation grants about storytelling, and the city can help, you know, facilitate a lot of that. So, I mean, I don't know that I have an exact list of every single type of nonprofit. I would just say that in general, you know, nonprofit organizations, 501c3s are going to be eligible to apply depending on what the purpose of the grant is. And again, government oftentimes are as well. I hope that answers the question. If not, like, ask it again and I'll come up with a different answer.
Yeah. No, I think it really does cover. This was a two-part question that was also inquiring as to the extent that a homeowner or a homeowner that produces some sort of income with their historic property, if there's any flexibility there as well.
Yeah, so if you're a building owner, let's say you own a two-flat, and that's your primary residence, and you want to redevelop that and create a housing unit, yes, then you would be eligible for some incentives because it's an income-producing property.
Yeah.
But if you're just looking to stay there and live there, and you want someone to pay for your rehabilitation costs, that's just going to be a non-starter.
Yeah, and I see that our participant there who asked that question gave a big thumbs up to you for addressing that, and that was a thorough answer for them. And wondering if you can speak to the specificities of the role that a community development block grant can also help with historic preservation. I know you touched on that a bit in your presentation, and if you wanted to talk about the specifics of that as well.
Yeah, so CDBG grants are, I think, an untapped resource that's available to communities. It's a federal program, and there are a whole host of parameters that need to be followed, and there's a lot of requirements as it relates to income eligibility, census tracts, right? So there has to be there's qualifying measures that need to be in play in order for for an entity to or city to apply for a CDBG grant. So of course that can get complicated, but what government grants aren't complicated. And then if you have identified a project that is within the purview or within the parameters of the CDBG, then you go through this application process, right? And then there's, again, DCOs, state officials that kind of help through that. But as it relates to preservation, I think that one, being able to help offset the costs for a consultant to develop a national register district, to do a survey, to create a district, create the nomination, I think that's extremely helpful, because oftentimes it's hard to find $20,000 or $30,000 for a project that may or may not, give you the end result that you are hoping for. I think the other thing with CDBG is, there are broad buckets that communities can look at in terms of trying to figure out ways to help themselves. So let's say, for example, that you have a main street and you check, you have the boxes checked that are required, census tract this, and it's like, okay, so we know that this project that's being applied for is eligible based on these guidelines. It's like, well, if we do this project, let's say it's a sewer project that, down the Main Street corridor, that's going to resolve a lot of the issues that building owners and residents have had, creating the disincentive to try to do the work. So I think that the CDBG question is always going to be reliant on what are the particulars of what you're looking to do. What exactly is it that you are trying to gain from the CDBG grant? And of course, there's a whole review process for all that. But I think that there definitely are people at the state that can answer specific questions around whether or not a project is eligible for a grant.
That's great. And of course, we've hit the hour, and really just want to thank everyone for the participation today. Again, we'll be sending out a follow-up email, not just with these materials and the recording, but also some information on the following part 2 of this series with Quinn. We really thank you, Quinn, for your time, and really are excited to have you back next month to cover more about this topic. And so we'll give folks information about that in the follow-up email, and you can, of course, forward that to folks you think should watch the recording and then tune in for the second webinar. And of course, some information about the Main Street webinar as well. Any other takeaway that you'd like to say, Quinn, before we sign off today?
Again, thank you for having me. We're really excited to have the opportunity to present to this group this time in next month. And if people do have questions, preservation related, please reach out. I see some communities here that we work with on a regular basis. I'm glad they're here too. So please reach out to me with specific questions. If I can't answer your question, find the answer or get you in touch with somebody that will. Landmarks Illinois, that's our role, is to help communities save places that are important to y'all. So look forward to working with anybody who may reach out, and definitely looking forward to the presentation on June 13th.
We are too, and thanks everyone and Quinn for joining us today with the Illinois Extension, and we hope to see you soon. Have a great rest of your week.
You too, thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.